The old woman spread her coins across the checkered tablecloth. A $10 bill, a few crumpled singles, then 1 quarter, another, and the handful of dimes she'd been keeping in the pocket of a coat that hadn't been new since the last president she'd bothered to vote for. The sound was small, just metal kissing fabric, but in that moment it cut through the whole restaurant, like someone had turned the music off at a funeral. A young mother near the door stopped mid-bite. 2 construction workers looked up from their plates. Even the ceiling fan, spinning lazy above the counter, seemed to make more company than wind. At the corner table by the window, Margaret Thornton, 78 years old, white hair pinned back with the same brooch her husband gave her on their wedding day, counted again with trembling fingers, not because she couldn't count, but because hope sometimes hides in the lining of an old purse if you're patient enough to look. She was short $3.75, and it was exactly then that a man at the opposite table let out a laugh. It wasn't a big laugh. It was worse. It was the kind of laugh designed to make someone feel small, without ever raising your voice, short, dry, precise. The way a man in a $10,000 suit laughs when he doesn't realize the whole room just learned more about him than he'd ever want them to know. His name was Dante Valentino. He was 36, dark-eyed, sharp-jawed, the kind of man who didn't walk into a room so much as change its temperature. What no one at Rosario's knew, not the waitress refilling waters, not the cook singing in the kitchen, not the old woman by the window, was that he controlled half the underground economy of New York City, and he hadn't felt ashamed of anything in almost a decade. But what happened in the next few minutes didn't just change the air inside that little Brooklyn restaurant, it changed him. And the 27-year-old waitress he hadn't even bothered to look at? She's the reason why. If this story hits you in the chest the way it hit me, do me a favor, tap that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that Tuesday afternoon in Brooklyn and find out what really happened inside Rosario's. Rosario sat on a quiet street in Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn, tucked between an old pharmacy whose sign had been peeling since last summer and a newsstand that sold old newspapers, peppermint candies, and conversations free of charge. The front of the restaurant didn't impress anyone from a distance. Just a faded hand-painted wooden sign, 2 small tables on the sidewalk, and a door that always stood open at lunchtime, as if the house were waiting for someone familiar to walk in without knocking. Inside, it was the kind of place that didn't try to impress anybody, and maybe that was exactly why people found it so easy to love. The smell of marinara sauce floated out from the kitchen before customers even had time to sit down, mingling with the scent of toasted bread and old wood soaked through with decades of olive oil and laughter. In the corner by the bar, a small television was playing baseball, the volume low enough for anyone who wanted to listen, and easy enough to ignore for anyone who didn't. Every time someone stepped through the door, the little brass bell hanging on the frame gave off one bright, clear ring, and almost every time, Frank Rosario lifted his head from behind the counter and recognized who had come in before they even had the chance to say their name. The walls were covered with black and white photographs, wedding pictures, neighborhood ball teams, smiling faces from different decades, all of them a little faded, as if time had passed through them first, before moving on to the rest of the street. The wooden chairs creaked whenever someone shifted. The thick glass tumblers, the heavy ceramic plates, the stainless steel forks and spoons had lost their shine, but they were still spotless. The lunch special cost $18.50, with pasta, salad, a drink, and a piece of cannoli for dessert. It wasn't cheap for everyone, but it wasn't expensive either for those who drove luxury cars there because they missed the taste of their mother's sauce. It was the fair price of a place that served real food to real people. On that Tuesday afternoon in October, a little past noon, the dining room was nearly full. An old man who had once been a mailman and was now retired sat in his usual corner reading a copy of the Daily News folded into quarters. A college student had spread her books across half the table, eating while underlining her textbook with a yellow highlighter. A delivery driver still wearing his brown uniform sat at the counter eating quickly, his eyes darting to the clock as if he were counting every minute of his lunch break. 3 bank employees in blue shirts shared a table, and shared every kind of office gossip between them. A young mother was trying to persuade her little daughter to eat her salad before she could have dessert, a battle everybody already knew she would lose. Rosario's was alive in the way only places could be, when they had become part of the breathing rhythm of an entire neighborhood. And standing behind it all, keeping everything moving without needing anyone to notice, was Frank Rosario, 63 years old, salt and pepper hair, a white apron tied around his waist, and a voice made slightly rough by 40 years of calling regulars by name and shouting into the kitchen. He knew who drank black coffee without sugar, who needed extra chili flakes, who was carrying sorrow and didn't want to talk about it. 40 years behind the same bar had taught him how to read people not by what they said, but by the way they sat down, the way they held a glass, the way they looked toward the door when they thought nobody was watching them. In the middle of that crowded lunch rush, there was one person moving between the tables who seemed to make almost no unnecessary sound at all. Alara Quinn, 27 years old, dark brown hair loosely tied at the nape of her neck, with the kind of face people had to look at twice before they realized it was beautiful, because the first thing they noticed was the exhaustion. She carried plates with her left hand, wrote down orders with her right, turned sideways to avoid chairs being pulled out by instinct alone, remembered who had asked for more water, who needed extra chili flakes, who was waiting for the bill without ever having to look back at her pad. She moved between the tables like someone who knew by heart the map of a place she called home even though it wasn't home, only the closest thing to that feeling she had ever had. Her white sneakers were worn down so badly the pattern on the soles had nearly disappeared, but they were scrubbed clean every night and left to dry by the window of her rented room in time for the morning shift. Around her left wrist she always wore a woven fabric bracelet. The color faded now. Not jewelry, not fashion, just something that was always there and that nobody asked about. Or if anyone ever had, she had answered by changing the subject so quickly that they forgot they had asked at all. There was one small habit she didn't know she had. Whenever a customer spoke, she tilted her head slightly to one side, only a few degrees, just enough to make the other person feel that what they were saying was truly being heard, not the kind of listening that waits for its turn to speak, but the kind of listening that belongs to someone who has known what it is to have no one listen at all. She didn't say much to customers beyond what was necessary, but the way she set a plate down, the way she poured water full enough without letting it spill, the way she remembered that the old mailman liked a second cup of hot coffee after his main course, all of it spoke for her in ways her mouth never did. Close to 1 o'clock, the kitchen swing door pushed open, and Tommy Rosario leaned his head out. 34 years old, Frank's only son, black hair with a slight curl always damp with sweat from standing beside the stove since morning, hands big but unexpectedly gentle when he arranged cilantro on a plate. He watched Alara pass by carrying an empty tray and tossed across the counter a piece of focaccia still warm, wrapped in wax paper. "Eat. You skipped breakfast again." His voice didn't ask. It stated, the kind of voice an older brother used with a younger sister, when both of them knew there was no room for denial. Alara caught the bread with one hand without breaking stride, tore it in half, took a small bite, then wrapped the other half back in the wax paper and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. That half would be her dinner, 7 hours later, on the last bus back to Bushwick. Or if she didn't have enough money for the bus, on the walk home, she would eat it crossing the bridge, where the wind off the river blew cold enough to cool the bread faster, but quiet enough that she wouldn't have to pretend she wasn't hungry. Nobody in the restaurant noticed that detail except Frank. He stood behind the counter, one hand polishing a glass that had long since become clean, but his eyes were on the girl across the dining room. He looked at her with the kind of gaze only people who had once lost something important ever had. The gaze of a father looking at a child who didn't share his blood but somehow belonged to him anyway, and he had known it from the first day she walked in, asking for work 3 years earlier. Wary eyes but a straight back, a soft voice but not a trembling one, and he had nodded before she had even finished her second sentence. The little brass bell on the doorframe gave a soft ring, and Alara looked up by reflex. Standing in the doorway was an elderly woman moving so slowly that the October sunlight had time to finish drawing her shadow across the wooden floor before she had even completed her second step inside. Margaret Thornton, 78 years old, her white silver hair gathered neatly at the nape of her neck, with the same kind of clips she had probably been using since the days when she still had to keep her hair from falling into trays of pastries in her own shop. On the front of her gray knit coat, just above her heart, was a small silver flower brooch, the kind of jewelry that wasn't expensive but was precious, because it had been fastened there by memory rather than by taste, a gift her husband had given her on their wedding day, 55 years earlier, and since then, she had never left the house without wearing it. Her old low-heeled shoes had long since faded in color, but they had been polished so clean they still caught a little of the overhead light. Her leather handbag was cracked at the corners, but the brass clasp still shone, the kind of clasp she wiped clean every week not because she needed to, but because habit told her to, and habit was the last thing that kept people standing, when the reasons to rise each morning grew fewer and fewer. The young woman at the register recognized her before she had even reached the counter. "Mrs. Thornton, haven't seen you in so long. Where have you disappeared to?" Maggie stopped, took one light breath as if she needed to gather strength after the short walk from the door, then smiled. A tired smile, but a real one in the way only someone who had lived long enough could smile, without needing to hide the weariness, and yet not letting it cover the warmth. "My knees complain louder than I do, sweetheart, but I couldn't miss today." The girl at the register nodded, and didn't ask another question. She only glanced toward the corner table by the window, the table everyone in the restaurant knew belonged to someone even though no sign carried a name. Alara had seen her from the moment the bell rang. She set her tray down on the counter, and went to Maggie without needing anyone to tell her, without needing Frank to signal, guided by that instinct she had never named but that always led her to exactly where she was needed. She walked beside Maggie through the dining room, slowing her pace to match the older woman's steps. Not ahead, not behind, only close enough for Maggie to know someone was there if she needed it, but not so close that she would feel as if she needed to be led. When they reached the corner table, Alara pulled out the chair, then did something that wasn't written into any staff training. She took a clean cloth napkin from the tray, folded it into 4, and placed it against the back of the chair as a cushion, so gently that Maggie barely noticed, until she sat down and felt the support against her back. She looked up and met Alara's eyes. Then she did something she rarely did with strangers. She reached out and took the girl's hand. Only for a second. Her lightly trembling fingers closed over the back of Alara's hand, and she said 2 words in a very soft voice. "Thank you, sweetheart." Those 2 words carried far more weight than the words themselves could hold, because she wasn't only thanking her for the napkin or the chair, she was thanking her because someone had seen her, truly seen her. In a world where old people so often became invisible, little by little, without anyone noticing, even themselves. Alara didn't say anything. She only gave a small nod and turned away to take another table's order. But Frank, watching from behind the counter, saw all of it, and he understood that the girl he had hired 3 years earlier, the girl no one had ever given anything to without asking for it back, was the one who gave most naturally in the whole room. Outside the window, Carroll Gardens moved on beneath the October sun, but Maggie wasn't looking at the street as it was now. She was looking at the street as it had been 55 years ago, when a young man had brought her to this restaurant for the first time, ordered the 2 cheapest glasses of wine on the menu, and told her that one day he would bring her back here every year. He had kept that promise. He had been gone for 10 years now, but she still came. Every year, on this exact day, the way people keep a promise to someone who has gone far away. Not because that person can still hear it, but because they themselves still remember. The restaurant door opened, and this time it wasn't the sound of the little brass bell that people noticed first, but the shift in the air, the kind of shift no one could name, and yet everyone could feel, like when the temperature in a room suddenly dropped by 2 degrees even though no one had opened a window. Dante Valentino walked in first, 36 years old, wearing a black custom-tailored suit without a single unnecessary crease, the kind of fabric that never had a price tag hanging on it because if you had to ask the price, you weren't their customer. On his left wrist was a watch worth more than most of the cars owned by the people in the room, but he didn't wear it to show off. He wore it because he lived in a world where every detail on a man's body was a signal, and his signal was, "Don't try." His eyes swept across the room in less than 3 seconds, but he had already taken in everything. The back door by the kitchen, the emergency exit beside the wine shelf, who was sitting near the entrance, who had their back turned to him. How many people were there? How many empty tables remained? It wasn't a habit. It was a survival reflex, sharpened by 8 years at the head of the Valentino family, where a man sitting in the wrong place in the wrong room might never stand up again. Right behind him came Nico Ferraro, 33 years old, large, built, his face so unreadable that strangers might have thought he had no feelings at all, when really he was only skilled at hiding them where no one could find them. Nico was Dante's right hand, loyal in a way that had almost gone extinct in their world, and the only man who still dared to speak plainly to Dante when it was necessary, though what counted as necessary had become rarer and rarer because Dante had become less and less willing to listen. The third man was Victor Crane, 40 years old, a lawyer in a gray suit, thin-framed glasses, and a smile that always sat in exactly the right place, as though it had been programmed there. So polite that anyone perceptive would understand it wasn't politeness at all, but a mask. Victor let his gaze move around the restaurant and his face didn't tighten, but the way he pulled out his chair and lightly brushed the seat before sitting down said everything for him. The reason they were here was simpler than their appearance suggested. Dante's car had broken down at a repair shop 2 blocks away, the transmission refusing to obey its owner just as their meeting in Brooklyn had run late, and hunger, unlike men, had no respect for anyone's schedule. Nico had suggested calling for takeout. Dante had been standing on the sidewalk when his eyes stopped, by accident, on the hand-painted wooden sign across the street, Rosario's, and something inside his mind had gone still. Rosario's, the name Gianna had once mentioned. His sister, Danny. "You've got to try it. They've got the best cannoli in Brooklyn," she had told him over the phone in that laughing voice he wouldn't get back now, no matter how much money he paid. He had always said he was busy. There was always a meeting, a deal, something more important than lunch with his sister. Then Gianna died, 19 years old, on a sidewalk in Bensonhurst. The bullet not meant for her, but still received by her. In a purge where he had been the real target, and yet not the one who fell. Today, October 15th, was the anniversary of her death. 8 years now. And Dante was standing in front of the restaurant his sister had loved most, the one he had never once stepped inside. "We're going in here," he said to Nico, without explaining. Nico didn't ask. They sat at a table in the middle of the dining room. Dante held the menu but didn't read it, his eyes moving across the words while his mind was somewhere else, on the sidewalk in Bensonhurst, in the hospital, beside the oak coffin he had chosen for his sister because she had liked light-colored wood. When Alara came to the table, a small order pad in hand, he didn't look up. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice even and professional. He named 3 dishes in a low voice, his eyes still on his phone screen, as if he were handling a minor inconvenience rather than ordering lunch. Alara finished writing, then turned to walk away, and in that moment, so brief he wondered whether he had imagined it, a scent drifted past him as she moved. Lavender, very faint, almost barely there, but enough to wake something in him because Gianna had used lavender shampoo too, and it had lingered just like that whenever she ran past the living room to grab her phone and burst into laughter. He looked up, but Alara already had her back to him, only the loosely tied brown hair, the worn apron, the scuffed sneakers left in view. He watched her for exactly 2 seconds, then looked away, because Dante Valentino didn't look at anyone longer than necessary, and because looking longer meant feeling, and feeling was the one thing he had forbidden himself to do from the night his sister never came home again. For the next several minutes, Rosario's existed like 2 worlds inside the same room, and no one seemed to notice the line that separated them. At the corner table by the window, Maggie ate slowly, 1 spoonful at a time, at the pace known only to people who no longer had anyone waiting for them at home. Now and then she paused in the middle of a bite, the spoon suspended a few inches above the plate, her eyes turned toward the street but not seeing the street that was there. She was looking at the street from some other year, where a man walked beside her on the opposite sidewalk, where the flower shop on the corner was still open, and he used to stop in every Friday to buy a single flower for no occasion at all. Sometimes her lips moved, very faintly, without sound, as if she were speaking to someone who no longer sat in the empty chair across from her, and yet was still there, in the only way she could still feel. She cut her meat into small pieces, and ate them one by one, not because she was picky, but because stretching out the meal meant stretching out the time she was allowed to sit at this table, and when the meal ended she would have to stand again, step outside, and return to the apartment that seemed to grow a little larger each day, because one person was missing from it. On the other side of the dining room, Dante Valentino cut his steak with knife and fork in cold, precise motions, each slice even, and exact as if even lunch were a task that had to be completed to standard. His phone lay beside his plate, the screen lighting up again and again. Messages, missed calls, notifications, and every so often he picked it up and spoke a few words in such a low voice that whatever the content was, it still sounded like an order, because Dante had forgotten a long time ago how to speak without commanding. Victor Crane sat across from him, going on and on about a real estate deal in Red Hook, projected profit, legal risks, numbers, percentages, his voice as smooth as if he were reading a PowerPoint presentation out loud. Nico sat beside him in silence, his back never resting against the chair, his eyes sweeping the room in a steady cycle every 15 seconds. Front door, kitchen door, window, then back to the front door. He ate with one hand, the other resting on his thigh, close to his waist, out of habit and without explanation. And between those two worlds, Elara moved back and forth, like the only thread stitching together two pieces of fabric in different colors, with neither piece aware that the other even existed. She refilled Maggie's water with that familiar, gentle tilt of her head, setting the glass down so lightly that not a single drop trembled, then turned and carried a side plate to Dante's table with the same calm, professional lack of emotion. Set the plate down, stepped back, didn't linger, didn't look. She gave Maggie gentleness because Maggie needed it, and she gave Dante's table invisibility because that was what he wanted. Two things entirely different, yet both were the way she read people, exact and silent, a skill no school had taught, but that 27 years of living had carved into her more deeply than any lesson ever could. No one in the room realized that the waitress in worn sneakers and a faded fabric bracelet was the only bridge between the two poles of that room, between the woman by the window speaking to memory and the man by the phone giving orders to the present. Maggie set her knife and fork down on either side of the plate, aligned neatly, gently, as if she were straightening the small world in front of her before speaking to God. Then she closed her eyes, lowered her head just a few degrees, only enough for her chin to nearly touch the silver brooch pinned to her chest. Her hands rested one over the other at the edge of the table, her fingers trembling faintly but clasped together as if they were holding on to something invisible. Her lips moved without sound, prayers she didn't need anyone else to hear because the one she was speaking to didn't require her to open her mouth. There was nothing theatrical in the gesture, nothing dramatic. Only a 78-year-old woman sitting in a small restaurant in Brooklyn on her wedding anniversary, bowing her head before her meal the way she had done every day for half a century, even on the days she wasn't sure anyone was listening, because her faith wasn't the kind that needed proof in order to exist. Victor Crane noticed first. His eyes were always searching for something to comment on, to classify, to place into the proper box in the invisible ledger inside his head where everyone had a price. He touched Dante's arm lightly with his elbow, flicked a glance toward the corner table by the window, then said in a low voice, quiet enough to stay at their table and yet sharp enough to cut, "Praying before lunch. That's special. Hope it works." Dante's mouth curved. It wasn't a smile, only a reflex, the kind of automatic response that came from a man who had lived too long in a world where sarcasm was the default language and tenderness was the mark of weakness. He let his mouth lift because Victor had let his mouth lift, because that was how this table worked. One man said something sharp, and the next man went along with it to keep the rhythm smooth, no one stopping to ask why they were laughing, or whose head the laughter landed on. But Nico didn't laugh. His jaw tightened, the muscles at his temples rose and fell, and he turned his face to look somewhere else, pretending to watch the front door as if he were focused on the job. Nico had grown up with a grandmother in Staten Island, who also prayed before every meal, in exactly that way. Eyes closed, head bowed, hands folded, and she too had trembled when she prayed in the final years of her life. Not because she was afraid, but because her body had grown more tired than her faith. He said nothing, because speaking now would have meant choosing a side, and choosing a side in front of Dante was something even Nico had to think carefully about. Victor's remark drifted through the air of the restaurant, small, light, almost harmless, but it was the kind of small that had teeth, the kind of sound the person being aimed at might not hear and still somehow feel, like a paper cut that didn't sting until later. Maggie finished her last bite, set her knife and fork down on the plate with the care of someone who treated a meal as a ritual rather than a habit, then took a paper napkin and gently touched the corner of her mouth before folding it neatly and placing it beside her glass of water. She sat there for another moment, looking out the window one last time as if saying goodbye to someone only she could see, then lifted her hand in a small signal. Elara noticed before Maggie had even raised it fully. She walked to the corner table and placed the bill face down beside the plate. $18.50, printed in black ink on white paper. An ordinary number to most people in the room, but to Maggie at that moment it wasn't a number at all. It was a question whose answer she had already known before opening her handbag. Maggie turned the bill over, read it, then opened the leather purse resting in her lap. Her fingers trembled, not with fear but with age, with the blood pressure medicine she took every morning, with joints that had stopped cooperating a long time ago. She searched through the bag by touch, because her eyes weren't as good anymore under the yellow light, pulling out one bill at a time, one coin at a time. placing them on the checkered tablecloth with the kind of care people reserved only for things that were precious or things that were scarce. Alara stood beside her. She didn't look down at the money appearing on the table, didn't count along, didn't let herself seem as though she were waiting. Instead, she turned her face toward the window as if she were watching the street outside, as if she were standing there for some reason other than waiting for an old woman to finish counting the last coins in her purse. She gave Maggie space, the invisible kind of space no one taught you to give, but anyone who had once been stripped of all privacy would understand its value better than anyone else. Behind the bar, Frank stopped polishing the glass. The glass in his hand had been clean long ago, but he kept turning the towel over its rim as if he were still busy, when in truth, his eyes were on the corner table, and his hands had already slowed, then stopped altogether. In the kitchen, Tommy stopped singing. The song he always hummed while sautéing onions and garlic broke off in the middle, and through the small window between the kitchen and the dining room, he looked out with the eyes of a man who had worked here long enough to know when the air in a room changed without anyone needing to say so. No one spoke, no one signaled, but the restaurant shifted frequency, the kind of shift everyone could feel, even if no one could have said exactly what it was, only that something was happening at the corner table by the window, and whatever it was made the sound of forks touching plates at the other tables grow softer, the sound of conversation lower, as if the whole room were holding its breath without realizing it was doing so. Maggie finished counting. She knew. She had known before she started, but she counted anyway, because hope was the one thing she never gave up on, even after it had given up on her many times before. She looked up, and her eyes met Alara's. The girl had turned back toward her at some point, and in the look that passed between those two women, one old and one young, one counting coins and one standing there waiting, there was something that didn't need to be spoken aloud because words would have only made it smaller. Maggie knew she was short, and both of them knew that the other one knew. Dante saw it. He had glanced toward the corner table a few times before, but this time his eyes stopped there, on the coins scattered across the checkered cloth, on the trembling hands trying to line them up, on the distance between the money on the table and the number printed on the bill, a distance the whole room seemed to feel without anyone saying it aloud. And this time he didn't hold back. Jesus Christ. The two words left his mouth in a voice that wasn't a shout, but was loud enough, clear enough, sharp enough to slice through every conversation in the room like the sound of glass shattering in a bedroom at midnight. Then he spoke again, still in that same voice, the voice of a man used to making an entire boardroom fall silent just by opening his mouth. If you can't afford to eat, you should stay home. Sitting here counting spare change is wasting the whole restaurant's time. Silence, but not ordinary silence. Not the comfortable kind that came when people ran out of things to say. Not the absent kind that drifted over a room while someone was chewing. This was the kind of silence that had weight. The kind that pressed down on the shoulders of people who had done nothing wrong. The kind that made someone holding a spoon suddenly not want to lift it to their mouth, because the sound of metal touching teeth would have seemed too loud inside that emptiness. The college student at the table near the door closed her book. Slowly, gently, as if even the sound of a book shutting was one more thing she didn't want to add to the room right now. The young mother tightened her grip on her daughter's hand, and the little girl looked up at her with wide eyes, not understanding why her mother's hand had suddenly grown warmer and tighter than usual. The old retired mailman set his coffee cup down without drinking, his eyes fixed on the surface of the cup as if he were reading something at the bottom. But in truth, he wasn't looking at anything at all. He was only trying not to look toward the corner table, because looking now meant witnessing, and witnessing without doing anything was its own kind of participation. Maggie didn't argue, didn't turn to look at the man who had spoken, didn't explain that she was only short by $3.75, didn't apologize for existing in the same room as someone who believed she didn't deserve to. She just sat there, and the head that had bowed during prayer lowered a little more. But this time it wasn't because she was speaking to God. It was because the world had just reminded her that there were places where faith couldn't shield her. A tear fell onto the checkered tablecloth, slow, silent, following the curve of her wrinkled cheek, before dropping onto the fabric without making a sound. And yet somehow louder than everything else in the room, she didn't wipe it away. Not because she wanted anyone to see, but because her hands were trembling too much to hide anything. And at 78 years old, after everything she had lost, she no longer had the strength to endure and pretend at the same time that she wasn't enduring. At Dante's table, Victor Crane let out a quiet laugh, small, neat, enough for Dante to know he agreed, but not loud enough for anyone else to place the blame on him, The kind of laugh made by a man who had turned cruelty into an art practiced from the second row. Nico was different. He didn't laugh, didn't nod, didn't react with any expression the person across from him could read. He only turned his face toward the window, looking out at the street, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle at his temple stood out beneath the skin, and under the table, his hand closed into a fist that no one saw. Nico said nothing because speaking now would have meant choosing a side, and choosing a side in front of Dante wasn't the kind of decision a man made with emotion, but the fist beneath the table didn't need reason's permission. Alara stood a few steps from the corner table, an empty tray in her hands, and for those few seconds she didn't move. Her eyes went from Maggie to the bar where Frank was standing, motionless, then back to Maggie, then to Frank again, as if she were reading a question written in the air that only she could see. She didn't ask anyone. She didn't look at Frank waiting for a signal, didn't glance toward Tommy in the kitchen for advice, didn't lower her eyes to her worn sneakers to weigh the cost. She set the tray down on the nearest table and walked straight to the corner table by the window, her steps even, unhurried, without drama, the way she walked every day to refill a glass or carry a plate, because if she moved any faster than usual, the whole room would look, and she didn't want the whole room looking. She wanted Maggie to have peace. When she reached her, she didn't remain standing over her. She lowered herself slightly, knees bent, back inclined, until her eyes were level with Maggie's, close enough for the older woman to hear her without effort, low enough that Maggie wouldn't have to lift her face to look up at anyone one more time today. Then Alara began picking up the coins from the checkered cloth, one by one. Gently, her fingers held each coin with the kind of care people reserved for fragile things, not because coins were fragile, but because what those coins represented was the dignity of a 78-year-old woman sitting alone in a restaurant on her wedding anniversary, and dignity was always thinner than people imagined. When she had gathered them all, she held the coins in her closed palm and spoke, not loud, not too soft, exactly in that register where Maggie could hear every word clearly, and yet still enough for the sound to drift across the dining room, reach Dante's table, and settle into every corner of the room without trying. Mrs. Thornton, you don't need to worry. You've found the restaurant's lucky coin. Maggie looked up, her eyes still wet, not understanding. Alara held up a quarter between two fingers at eye level and smiled. The first smile of the day. That wasn't a service smile, wasn't a polite smile, but the smile of someone building a beautiful story with her own hands in the middle of an ugly moment and believing in it enough to make it true. The restaurant has a tradition. When a special guest finds the lucky coin, the bill has already been paid, and there's still credit left for next time. She said it in such an ordinary voice that almost everyone in the room could have believed it was a real tradition, the kind of old tradition every family restaurant had, but never posted on the wall. The kind passed from mouth to mouth among the people who had been there long enough to know that some things didn't need explaining, only preserving. Maggie looked at the girl, looked at the coin, looked back at the girl, and on her face, surprise gave way to something deeper. Relief. The kind of relief that belonged to someone who had just been caught before falling and hadn't needed to ask, "God bless you, sweetheart." Her voice broke on the last word, because sweetheart was what she had once called her daughter, before her daughter moved to California and stopped calling, and she had called Alara that same word 15 minutes earlier when the girl had folded a cloth behind her back for support, and every time the word carried the weight of all the times she had wanted to say it to someone, and there had been no one there to hear it. Alara gave a small nod, as if she hadn't done anything extraordinary, then stood up and went back to work, carrying plates, wiping tables, pouring water, as if the universe hadn't just shifted a little at the corner table by the window. But afterward, when no one was looking, when the dining room had thinned out and Frank was busy at the register, she went behind the counter, opened the small tin box where she kept her tips for the day, counted out exactly $3.75, and slipped it into the cash drawer beside Maggie's bill. That money was her bus fare back to Bushwick tonight, which meant that tonight, when her shift at Rosario's ended and she still had to go to the bar for her second shift, and then make her way home close to midnight, she wouldn't have money for the bus. She would walk nearly 3 miles across Brooklyn in the October cold, past blocks so dark that every other streetlight seemed broken, past the corners she already knew by heart, where to walk faster and where to stay away. She didn't tell anyone, not because she wanted to hide it, but because in 27 years of living, Alara had never developed the habit of telling anyone about the things she gave up, because who was there to tell, when there had never really been anyone to tell? Dante watched the entire scene from beginning to end. From the moment Alara lowered herself until her eyes were level with the old woman's to the moment she stood and turned away as if nothing had happened. And the smile he had been wearing since he spoke those words vanished. Not slowly, but vanished as if someone had flipped off a switch inside his mind that he hadn't known was there. He set down his knife and fork and pushed his chair back. Victor looked at him, his brow tightening slightly. Let it go. Dante didn't look at Victor. No. One word, spoken low, without explanation. And Victor had worked with Dante long enough to know when a single word meant the discussion was over. Dante crossed the dining room, past tables of customers trying not to look at him and still looking anyway, and stopped at the bar where Frank Rosario was standing. Frank was still there, in exactly the same place he had stood from the beginning, one hand holding the towel that had gone dry long ago, his eyes having followed everything without moving a single step, without interfering with a single word, because Frank was the kind of man who understood that some scenes had to be allowed to finish before judgment was passed, even when that judgment had already formed in his mind from the very first second Dante opened his mouth. The two men stood facing each other across the wooden counter, and between them was a distance measured not only by the width of the bar, but by two completely different worlds. Dante spoke first, in a controlled voice, the voice he used in meeting rooms when someone had made a mistake, and he was giving them a chance to explain before he decided the consequences. Your employee just made up a story to pay a customer's bill. That's not how you run a business. Tomorrow someone else comes in without enough money. Is she going to do the same thing again? Frank didn't move, didn't nod, didn't shake his head, didn't frown, didn't change his stance. He looked at Dante with the eyes that 40 years behind a bar had given him. The eyes of a man who had seen every kind of powerful man walk through that door, from ward politicians to union bosses, to faces he knew better than to ask the names of, and they had all shared one thing, the certainty that any room they stepped into belonged to them. Frank wiped his hands on his apron, slowly, then asked in a calm voice, the same voice he might have used to ask a customer whether he wanted more water or more bread. You're not from this neighborhood, are you? Dante tilted his head slightly, only a few millimeters, but enough for Frank to know the question had touched something that a suit worth $10,000 and an expensive watch couldn't hide. Does that matter? It matters. Frank didn't raise his voice or lower it. He kept the same tone, like a man talking about the weather, when in truth he was talking about something much heavier than the weather. Then his gaze shifted lightly toward the corner table by the window, where Maggie was sitting quietly, her eyes back on the street outside, her hands resting in her lap, small and still like someone who had grown so used to sitting alone that she had forgotten she was in a place with other people. That old woman saved this place. Dante blinked. Not an ordinary blink, but the kind that came from a man who had just heard something that didn't fit into any box inside the system. He had spent 36 years building to classify the world. Frank didn't wait for him to react. He began to speak, in an even voice, without drama, without rise or fall, without adding color. And because of that, every sentence landed with twice the weight of what it contained. 18 years ago, his father had still been alive, and this restaurant had been dying, 3 months behind on the rent, with the landlord having sent a final notice on red paper and taped it to the door. Owing the meat supplier, the vegetable supplier, owing Con Edison for electricity, owing for gas, even owing the laundry that washed the tablecloths. His father had started selling things from the kitchen, the meat grinder first, then the extra oven, then the copper pots his grandfather had brought over from Naples, each item disappearing, one by one from the kitchen, the way people sold organs to keep a body alive for one more week. No bank would have lent them money because the credit history of a family restaurant in Brooklyn wasn't something banks wanted to look at. No relatives helped, not because they were cruel, but because everyone was already carrying their own weight. And in that neighborhood, people didn't lack love. They only lacked money. His father had started writing letters to the landlord, asking for 2 more weeks. The kind of letters both the writer and the reader knew were the last plea before the locks were changed. Then one afternoon, and Frank remembered clearly that it was a Thursday, because Thursday was the restaurant's slowest day, Maggie walked in. She was younger then, her back still straight, her steps still quick, running a small bakery 4 blocks away, the bakery everyone in the neighborhood knew by name, doing well enough for her and her husband to live comfortably in the way Brooklyn people meant when they said comfortable, not rich, but not counting coins before going to the market. She sat at the corner table by the window, ordered the lunch special, ate in silence, paid, and stood to leave. Before she reached the door, she stopped at the counter, placed an envelope in front of Frank's father, and said, "For you," then walked out without looking back. Frank paused for a moment. His eyes were still on Dante, but he was also looking at all of 18 years ago at once. Inside the envelope, he went on, was cash, exact, precise. Not a dollar more and not a dollar less. Enough to clear every debt. Rent, suppliers, staff wages, Con Edison, gas, the laundry. As if she had known every figure, every bill, every sleepless night his father hadn't told anyone about. Tucked in with the money was a small handwritten note in blue ink, neat handwriting in the style of someone who had written receipts all her life. And on it there was only one sentence. "A neighborhood without a good restaurant loses a piece of its soul." Frank said that sentence in English, slowly, clearly, as if he were repeating it from memory rather than translating it, because there were some lines that lost their weight the moment they were carried into another language. She never asked for it back, never mentioned it again, never told anyone, never took credit. His father had tried to repay her in every possible way, offering her free meals, sending pastries to her bakery, proposing monthly installments, and she had refused all of it. She had only said one thing, something Frank remembered now, and would remember until the day he could remember nothing else. "When life allows it, we hold up one small piece of the world so it doesn't fall." Frank looked straight into Dante's eyes, and this was the first time in the whole conversation that anything changed in his voice. Not that he raised it, but he let the calm layer drop away and revealed what had always been underneath, the thing he had kept hidden for 40 years behind this bar. "She comes here every year on this exact day, her wedding anniversary. Her husband loved this restaurant. They sat at that table by the window. She ordered dessert before the main course. It was their habit. He has been gone for 10 years now. Since then, she comes alone. Same meal, same table, looking out at the street, sitting for a little while, then leaving." Frank stopped, not to create drama, but because he needed one breath before saying the last sentence, the sentence he spoke in a voice that didn't rise or fall, flat as the wooden counter between them, but heavy enough for Dante to feel it pressing against his chest. "So no, Alara didn't make anything up. In this restaurant, Mrs. Thornton's bill doesn't exist. Not ever. Not while I'm still breathing." Dante stood at the bar, and for the first time in nearly a decade, he had nothing to say. It wasn't the silence of control, the kind of silence he used in boardrooms when he wanted everyone at the table to wonder what they had done wrong. This was a different kind of silence. The silence of a man who had just been stripped of his weapon in the middle of a battle he hadn't even known he was fighting. Frank had already turned back to wiping down the counter, no longer looking at him, not out of contempt, but because he had finished speaking and, to him, that was enough. The rest belonged to the person who had heard it. Dante stood there, his eyes still turned toward the corner table by the window, but he wasn't looking at Maggie anymore. He was looking at the empty chair across from her, the chair no one had sat in for 10 years. And in his mind that chair wasn't empty. Sitting there was a 19-year-old girl with long black hair, laughing louder than anyone else in the room. And that girl was Gianna, his sister. Gianna, who used to call him on Saturday nights just to say, "Danny, you've got to try Rosario's. They've got the best cannoli in Brooklyn." In a voice so excited it sounded as if she had discovered a secret of the universe, instead of a small restaurant in Carroll Gardens. Gianna, who ordered cannoli before antipasto because she said life was short, eat dessert first and figure out the rest later. And at the time he had laughed because he thought she was only joking, not knowing that it was the truest philosophy she would ever leave behind. He had always said he was busy. Every time she invited him, he had a reason. A meeting, a deal, a trip. Something more important than sitting down to lunch with his little sister in a small restaurant. And now he was standing in that restaurant, 8 years after her death, realizing that nothing in those 8 years had been more important than one lunch with Gianna that he had turned down. She had been shot on a Bensonhurst sidewalk on a Wednesday evening in October, 19 years old, wearing a denim jacket, earbuds still playing music, on her way home from an evening class at community college. The bullet hadn't been meant for her. It had been meant for him, or for one of his men. But the shooter hadn't known how to tell the difference, and Gianna had passed that corner exactly 11 wrong seconds too soon. He had reached the hospital at 3 o'clock in the morning, and when the doctor said, "I'm sorry," in the voice of someone who had grown too used to saying those words, Dante hadn't cried, hadn't shouted, hadn't broken anything. He had only stood there looking at the white sheet being pulled over his sister's body, and felt something inside him go dark, not break, go dark, as if someone had pulled a plug from a socket and the whole room had fallen black. From that night on, Dante hadn't felt ashamed of anything, not because he had nothing to be ashamed of, but because he had shut down the ability to feel shame along with everything else, because feeling meant pain, and if Gianna wasn't there for him to call and tell about it, then where was that pain supposed to go? But standing at the bar of Rosario's, hearing Frank talk about an old woman who had given everything without keeping anything back, and who still had life take her husband, take her bakery, take her health, take even the last $3.75 she had to pay for lunch. Something struck his chest and he didn't hear a gunshot. It didn't come from outside. It came from the place he had thought had gone dark, and it turned out it hadn't gone dark at all. It had only been waiting. He went back to the table. Victor looked at him with the expression of a man waiting for an explanation. What was that? What did he say? Dante didn't answer. Not because he was angry, not because he was dismissing Victor, but because he didn't have words yet for what was happening in his head, and Dante was the kind of man who didn't speak when he didn't yet have the right words. He sat down, looked at the half-eaten steak on his plate, looked at the phone beside his right hand, the screen still lighting up, messages still coming in, the underworld still turning, but for the first time since that night in the hospital in Bensonhurst, he didn't touch it. The phone lay there, lighting up and going dark, lighting up and going dark, and Dante looked at it as if it belonged to someone else, someone he had stopped being about 3 minutes earlier, but still didn't know who he was about to become. The penthouse on the 42nd floor looked down over Manhattan from the kind of height only money could buy. Dante stepped inside without turning on the main lights, letting only the hallway lamps come alive on their sensors, enough for him to see where he was going, but not enough for the room to see his face. He took off his watch and set it on the marble counter beside the sink, but the weight of the day hadn't been on his wrist. It was somewhere else, somewhere a watch couldn't touch. He poured himself a glass of Macallan, the 25-year kind, a single bottle worth 3 months of rent for most people in Brooklyn, lifted it, took one sip, then set it down and didn't pick it up again. The television on the wall lit up. CNN, a line of text running beneath the screen, someone talking about interest rates, or the election, or something else that Dante would have normally listened to with half an ear while reading emails with both eyes. But tonight he left the television muted and didn't read a single word. He opened his laptop. Spreadsheets, numbers, percentages. A land deal in Red Hook Victor had sent that afternoon. A situation in Jersey Nico had texted needed to be handled this week. 3 emails from an underboss in Queens, 2 messages marked urgent. He read the first line of the first email and realized his eyes were moving across the words, while his mind held on to none of them, like water running over glass. He closed the laptop, opened it again, closed it again. Nothing could hold his mind for more than 2 minutes, because every time his thoughts tried to hide inside numbers or deals or the situation in Jersey, they were dragged back to the same place, the same image, the tear on the checkered cloth, falling slowly, silently, along the curve of the 78-year-old woman's wrinkled cheek, the woman he had mocked in front of an entire room. Then Frank's words, spoken without raising his voice, flat, heavier than any threat Dante had ever heard in his life. Mrs. Thornton's bill doesn't exist. Not while I'm still breathing. Then the scent of lavender, passing by, so faint it had almost not been there, but enough to wake the thing he had tried to bury. He thought about his world, the world where every action had a price, every favor was a loan, every kindness was an investment waiting to collect interest. In that world, the waitress had broken the one rule he had believed was unchangeable. She had given without calculation, without expectation, without keeping score, given away the last $3.75 she had, and he knew with certainty that for her it had been a real number, because no one invented a lucky coin tradition in a voice that trembled like that unless the money hurt to give. He sat there in the darkness of the penthouse, the full glass of whiskey beside him, the silent television showing news of a world he didn't belong to, and for the first time in 8 years he asked himself who he had become. Not who he had become in the underworld, that part he knew very well, but who he had become in ordinary rooms, where people ate lunch and prayed and counted coins, and cried without asking permission. He couldn't find the answer, and not being able to find it was the very thing that kept him awake. Earlier, on the drive back from Brooklyn to Manhattan, at 11 o'clock that night, Nico had taken a shortcut through Bushwick, a route he knew from the years when he had still been running errands for the family. Dante sat in the back seat, his eyes on the window but not really seeing anything, until the car passed a quiet block near Flushing Avenue, and his eyes caught the shape of someone on the sidewalk. A girl walking alone, brown hair tied loosely back, a thin coat not warm enough for an October night, a small crossbody bag at her side, walking fast but not afraid, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who had grown used to the world being unsafe and had chosen to live inside it rather than run from it, because running required somewhere to run to, and she had never had that place. Dante recognized her, the worn sneakers, the fabric bracelet on her wrist, the way she moved. Something he had seen for only a few seconds in the restaurant and yet somehow had kept. Stop the car. Nico looked into the rearview mirror. Why? Stop the car. The car stopped. Dante lowered the window and looked outside. Alara was half a block away, turning into a narrow alley between two old buildings, the yellow streetlight falling across her back and then disappearing when she vanished around the corner. He didn't open the door, didn't call out, didn't signal Nico to do anything. He only sat there, the man who controlled half of New York's underground economy, sitting inside a black car with bulletproof windows, watching a 27-year-old girl walk nearly 3 miles through Brooklyn in the cold night because she had given away her last $3.75 to an old woman she owed nothing. Boss? Nico asked after 10 seconds of silence, his voice quiet, the kind of voice he only used when he knew Dante was somewhere orders couldn't reach. Dante raised the window. Drive. The car moved on, but his eyes stayed on the rearview mirror, on the narrow alley that had swallowed the girl's shadow, and he kept looking until the alley disappeared behind the turn, until Brooklyn slipped away behind them and Manhattan rose ahead in a million lights, none of them brighter than the last image he had seen that night. A girl walking alone into the dark without once looking back. 3 days later, at 6 o'clock in the morning, Frank Rosario opened the restaurant with the key he had been using for 40 years, a key so worn that its teeth had almost gone smooth, and yet the lock still recognized it in the way only things that had been together long enough could still recognize each other. He turned on the lights, walked through the empty dining room, and when he reached the bar, he stopped. On the wooden counter, exactly where he always set his first cup of coffee every morning, there was a white envelope. No name, no address, no sign of who had left it there or how it had gotten inside the restaurant when the door was still locked. Frank picked up the envelope, weighed it in his hand, then opened it. Inside was cash, $100 bills, stacked neatly, enough that he didn't need to count to know it would cover hundreds of lunch specials for people to whom even $3.75 was the distance between eating and not eating. Tucked in with the money was a note, handwritten, the penmanship straight, clean, without flourish. For whoever needs it, no contract, no debt. Frank read it, didn't smile, didn't call anyone over, didn't take a picture, didn't lock it away in the safe. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into the pocket of his apron, exactly the way his father had once done with Maggie's note 18 years earlier, because some things didn't deserve to sit in a drawer. They deserved to rest close to the chest, close to where the heart beat. From that day on, whenever a customer opened a wallet and realized there wasn't enough, something always happened at Rosario's. A cannoli from the house, a quiet line that said, "Someone's already taken care of it today," or, "You've got credit here." No one asked why, no one explained how, and Frank never said where the envelope had come from, because he didn't know for certain, and because knowing for certain wouldn't have changed a thing. Kindness didn't need a return address. But the world wasn't made only of checkered cloths and cannoli. Running alongside those peaceful lunches in Carroll Gardens, on another floor of the city, Victor Crane sat in his law office on the 34th floor in Midtown, looking at his laptop screen with the eyes of a man who never looked at anything without calculating what it was worth. Victor had noticed. Dante was going down to Brooklyn too often, not for business, not for territory, not for any reason that existed in the books. He had someone follow him, discreetly, professionally, and after 2 weeks, the report came back with a name, an address, and a photograph taken from a distance of the brown-haired girl in an apron standing in front of the small restaurant. Victor said nothing right away. He kept that information the way a man kept a chess piece whose turn hadn't yet come. But at the underboss meeting that week, while Dante was listening to a report from Queens, Victor slipped in a remark in a voice as light as if he were talking about the weather. "Boss has been going down to Brooklyn a lot lately. Hope the pasta there is worth our time." No one in the meeting laughed. Dante turned his eyes toward Victor, slowly, and looked at him with a stare. Every man in the room understood, because they had seen that stare before, and the last time they had seen it, the man who received it had never sat at that table again. Victor didn't look away, because looking away would have been admitting he had already lost, but he didn't add another word either, because one more sentence now might have been his last. The seed of suspicion had been planted. In Dante's world, suspicion didn't need evidence to take root. It only needed the right sentence, at the right moment, in front of the right people. And worse than all of that, suspicion wasn't the only danger. The Marchetti family, the rival organization looking for any possible way to pressure the Valentino Empire, was watching too. They watched the way organizations like that always did. Not loudly, not impatiently, only with patience, searching for the soft place. And then one late evening, at 9:45, 20 minutes before closing, two men walked into Rosario's. They weren't regulars. They weren't from the neighborhood. Dark coats, leather shoes, faces without expression. The kind of faces ordinary people wouldn't recognize as wrong, but someone who had lived through foster care and Walmart parking lots would recognize at once, because she had learned how to read danger before she ever learned how to read books. They took a table near the door, didn't open the menu, didn't order water, only sat there. One of them glanced around the dining room. The other looked straight at Alara. "Have you worked here long?" Alara stood beside the counter, a cleaning cloth in her hand. She didn't step back, didn't angle herself toward the rear door, didn't let her voice shake even though her heart was beating faster than usual. "We're closing soon." 3 words, voice even, eyes steady, not inviting, not pleading, not challenging. Only the truth spoken by someone who had lived on the street long enough to know that fear was something dangerous. Men could smell, and calm was the only armor that came free. Footsteps came from the kitchen. Tommy stepped out and stood behind Alara, bigger than her by a head, flour still on his hands, his eyes on the two men with the look Frank Rosario's son had learned from 40 years of living in Brooklyn. The look that said, "This is my house and you weren't invited." The two men stood up, said nothing more, walked out the door. But on the table where they had been sitting, they left behind a white business card, with no name, no phone number, only an embossed symbol in the center. And when Dante saw that symbol 2 days later, his eyes darkened in a way Nico knew meant that someone had just crossed a line no one was ever allowed to cross. The following week, Dante came back to Rosario's, alone. No Victor, no meeting, no business reason he could use to justify an underworld boss sitting in a family restaurant in Carroll Gardens, ordering an $18.50 lunch special. He parked 3 blocks away, walked there, came in through the front door like any ordinary customer, took a quiet corner table beside the wine shelf, not the one by the window, and ordered in a voice that, for the first time since Alara had served him, didn't sound like a command. He ate in silence, left a tip 10 times the size of the bill, said nothing unnecessary, then left. The next week he came again, and the week after that too. Always alone, always in that corner, always the lunch special, always a large tip folded beneath the coaster, so Alara would only see it when she cleared the table, after he was gone, when she couldn't return it or refuse it. Little by little, between those arrivals and departures, small fragments of conversation began to appear. Not conversations exactly, only short lines exchanged across the counter or beside the table, the kind of lines that would sound like nothing to anyone outside of them, but that the people inside them would know were building something out of very small bricks. "What's good today?" "Pasta e fagioli." Tommy's singing in the kitchen. He only sings when the food's good. Dante looked at her, and the corner of his mouth shifted. Not enough to call it a smile, but enough for Alara to notice that this was the first time she had seen the muscles in his face do something that didn't look like judgment or command. "How do you know?" "Because I've listened to him sing for 3 years, and every time he sings off key, the dish is excellent. If he sings in key, you should order something else." That time Dante almost smiled for real. Almost. Because the defense system he had built over 8 years wasn't going to collapse because of one joke. But it trembled. And trembling was the first step. Alara didn't know who he was. She thought he was an ordinary businessman. Maybe finance. Maybe real estate. The kind of man who had money but ate lunch alone on Tuesday afternoons, which probably meant no one was waiting for him at home. Frank knew. Frank had known from the first time Dante walked in, Not because he recognized his face, but because 40 years of reading, people had taught him how to recognize weight, and Dante Valentino carried the kind of weight ordinary men didn't. But Frank said nothing, because in this restaurant, people were customers before they were anything else, and Frank believed in that the same way he believed in his father's marinara sauce, without compromise and without exception. Meanwhile, on another floor of the story that Alara and Frank couldn't see, Dante was handling things. The white card with the embossed symbol lay on his desk in the penthouse, and when he looked at it, his eyes darkened in the way Nico had seen many times before, and every time he had seen it, he had known how it would end. The Marchetti family. Dante called Nico in, handed him the card, and didn't say much. The following week, a new security camera system appeared at Rosario's, sent by a community security program supporting small businesses that Frank had never heard of, but accepted because the old system had been broken since summer, and he hadn't had the money to replace it. He was suspicious, but when the installers arrived, they were professional, polite, and had paperwork, and the cameras worked well. Frank didn't ask anything more, because Frank was the kind of man who knew not every question needed an answer. As for the threat from the Marchettis, Dante handled that the way he always handled things, quickly, precisely, ruthlessly, in a language only his world understood. And after that, no one ever set foot in Rosario's with any purpose other than eating lunch. No one knew. Not Frank, not Tommy, not Alara. That was how Dante protected, silently, invisibly, the way he hadn't protected Gianna. And now he was trying to make up for that by protecting everything around him in her place. A few weeks later, the bell over the door at Rosario's rang at lunchtime, and Maggie walked in. The same gray knit coat, the same silver flower brooch, the same slow steps, the same tired but genuine smile when she greeted the girl at the register. Alara led her to the corner table, folded the cloth behind her back for support, poured her water, and everything unfolded like a ritual both of them knew by heart without ever having practiced it. At the end of the meal, when the plate was clean and the water glass was empty, Maggie reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a small photograph. The edges curled, the colors slightly faded, and placed it beside the water glass with the gentleness people reserved only for sacred things. In the picture was a man smiling, black hair, warm eyes, a simple open collared shirt, smiling with his whole face and not just his mouth, the kind of smile that made you understand at once why someone could love that person for 55 years. Alara passed by and slowed down without realizing she had slowed. "Your husband?" Maggie looked at the photograph, and on her face appeared a smile Alara had never seen before, younger, sadder, truer than any smile she had worn in this restaurant, the smile of someone seeing a person untouched by time. "He was always better looking than me." Alara didn't say anything, only tilted her head slightly in the way she always did when someone said something true, then turned away. When she came back with a cannoli from the house, the photograph had already been put away, and Maggie's eyes were back on the window, on the street, on the afternoon light in Carroll Gardens. But this time, Alara realized, Maggie's eyes were less sorrowful than before, as if every time she came back here, every time she sat at that table and spoke to the person who was no longer there, the grief didn't lessen, but it changed shape, from an open wound into a scar, still there, but no longer bleeding. Late one evening, close to 9:45, Rosario's had gone quiet. The last chairs had been turned upside down onto the tables. The floor had just been mopped and still gleamed wet beneath the yellow lights, and the smell of floor cleaner mixed with the lingering scent of marinara to create that smell only a restaurant had at closing time, the smell of a day that had just ended. Alara was wiping down the bar alone. Tommy had left half an hour earlier. Frank had locked the back door and told her to lock the front before she went. The little brass bell rang. She looked up and saw Dante standing in the doorway. Black suit, empty hands. No Nico, no Victor, no phone pressed to his ear. Just a man standing in the frame of a small restaurant in Brooklyn looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him in all the weeks he had been coming here. The expression of someone who hadn't come to order food. "We're closing soon." "I know." Those two lines hung between them for a few seconds, light but not empty, because both of them understood that he hadn't come because he was hungry, and she wasn't really sending him away. Dante stepped inside, crossed the empty dining room, sat at his usual corner table beside the wine shelf, not the window table. That table wasn't his, and he knew it. Alara didn't ask what he wanted. She set the cleaning cloth down, took a clean glass, poured water, walked to his table and placed it in front of him with the kind of ease that neither of them realized had become a habit. Sometime along the way, without either of them noticing, that first glass of water never needing to be asked for, set in exactly the right place to the right, at exactly the right distance from the edge of the table, as if her hand had measured it without needing a ruler. Dante looked at the glass of water, then at her, and he spoke in a voice Alara was hearing for the first time. A voice without control, without command, without distance, the voice of a man stripping off the armor he had worn for 8 years and not knowing what, if anything, was left underneath. That night, the old woman counting coins. I was the one who laughed. Alara stopped moving, still holding the cloth she had picked back up without knowing when, and looked at him, straight at him, without looking away, without surprise, without anger. I know. Those 2 words hit Dante not like a slap, but like a door opening. Because I know meant she had known from the start, had known every time he walked in, every time she poured the first glass of water, every time she carried a plate to his table. She knew who he was, knew what he had done, and she had still served him. Then why do you still serve me? Alara was quiet for a beat, and in that silence she wasn't thinking of the answer, because the answer had been there a long time. She was only finding the truest way to say what she believed, because Mrs. Thornton would have done the same. She'd never have asked whether someone deserved a seat before feeding them. That sentence struck Dante harder than any bullet he had avoided in 8 years at the head of the family, because bullets he knew how to dodge. But unconditional kindness from someone he had hurt was something no armor could stop. He didn't change overnight, didn't make declarations, didn't offer promises. Dante Valentino wasn't the kind of man who promised things because he knew that in his world promises were cheaper than bullets. But from then on, every week he came. Every week she poured the first glass of water without asking. Every week they spoke a little more, a little longer, a little deeper, like 2 people building a bridge from opposite banks. And each week the bridge grew a few inches shorter without either of them counting. Then one evening, the next month, or maybe the month after, the timing didn't need to be exact because the truest things rarely came with exact dates. Dante was standing outside Rosario's when Alara stepped out and locked the door. He had been waiting there for who knew how long. A black car was parked half a block away, lights off, Nico sitting inside without looking out. Let me take you home. Alara looked at the car, looked at him. I'm used to walking. I know, but tonight you don't have to walk alone. She stood there for 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which 27 years of living passed through her. The nights in the Honda Civic, the Walmart parking lots, the foster homes she had run from at 3 in the morning, the dark blocks she had crossed alone because there had never been another choice, and all the times someone had offered her something and there had always been a price attached behind it. But his voice wasn't asking for anything. His eyes weren't asking for anything. He was only standing there, the man the underworld called ruthless, standing on a sidewalk in Carroll Gardens at 10 o'clock at night, waiting for a waitress to finish her shift without asking her for anything in return. She got into the car, not because the car was beautiful, not because he was rich, not because the night was cold, but because for the first time in 27 years, someone had stood waiting for her without asking to be paid back in any form at all. Inside Rosario's, no one ever put a reserved sign on the corner table by the window. There was no name engraved there, no framed photograph, no plaque of honor, but almost always, when the restaurant was quiet, no one sat there, as if the whole neighborhood understood without discussion, without anyone needing to say it aloud, that some places belonged to memory before they belonged to space, and memory didn't need a nameplate in order to exist. In the end, it wasn't the coins that made the deepest sound that day. It wasn't the laughter. It wasn't the revelation. What remained was something else. The distance between looking at someone and seeing only what they lacked, or looking at someone and seeing the whole life they were carrying without ever needing to display it for anyone. Because the value of a human being was never in the amount of money they placed on the table. It was in what they carried when no one was looking, and sometimes all it took was one ordinary lunch, $3.75 missing, and one act of kindness at exactly the right moment to remind an entire room of that truth. That is where today's story comes to an end. But before I say goodbye, I want to ask you one question. Have you ever witnessed a moment in real life, in a restaurant, on a bus, or even inside your own family, when one small act by someone completely changed the way you saw them? Share that story in the comments. I read every line, and I truly believe the real stories that come from your hearts can touch people more deeply than any script I could ever write. If today's story touched you, please hit like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe so you won't miss the new stories coming every day. I wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day that passes. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.